This year I had plans for producing a succession of a lot of quick-growing crops, trying to get a more continual supply of smaller harvests throughout the year. This worked quite well earlier in the season in the polytunnel, but a few things have badly affected the supply of these vegetables now that the cropping has shifted to the outside beds. I expect things to improve in the next month or so, but right now it's a bit demoralizing looking at these beds between the two polytunnels. These intensively cropped beds should be producing a lot of vegetables, but instead the harvests are not great, and we are pulling up struggling plants and waiting for seeds and transplants to grow. Now that some of the summer crops are starting to produce, it's not really a hunger gap that we're experiencing, but it's a gap in a wider range of crops, a gap that I was hoping to avoid. The main reason for this gap in crops is that I didn't do my job as a grower. I didn't have the capacity or was distracted elsewhere, and didn't focus on the tasks that we needed to do in these outside beds that were set aside for these quick rotation crops. There was a plan that I didn't keep up with or adapt to the changing conditions, so there weren't transplants ready to go into the ground when one of the crops was finished, and we didn't keep up with the direct sowing. And some of the seedlings that we did have were transplanted late or not properly hardened off, so the seedlings have struggled to become established. Some of the crops would have really benefited from fleece or crop covers to provide some protection from the elements and pests, but we had removed all the covers earlier in the season to make the beds easier to manage. Basically, I'm not used to managing beds like this, where there are more than 40 crops with different needs and at different stages of development, and I haven't given them enough time and attention. And of course, exploring and trying new things means there's going to be a gap in some things and oversupply of other things at some times. There have also been fertility issues in these outside beds, which have not been well developed, and we didn't apply enough compost and fertility at the beginning of the season. I'm realizing now how this type of intensive cropping requires an abundance of fertility and really well-developed soil, and it's just not there yet, and an uneven availability of fertility can be seen in some of the crops. In one small patch of beetroots, some of the plants are strong and growing well, and other plants are stunted and showing signs of deficiencies, even though they're growing really close together. And with a fairly dense planting of chard, which we didn't start harvesting early enough because there was an abundance available in the polytunnel, the plants have grown so big that they're struggling to compete with each other for the limited resources available in the soil. I need to make sure to top up the fertility of each section of the bed before the next crop, and we could probably do a lot more liquid feeding. I also need to pay more attention to how early the plants need to be harvested, depending on the density that we planted in the individual batches, to not let any of the plants get too big and to thin them when necessary. The changing weather conditions this year has also been problematic. First it was cold and windy and everything needed to be covered. Then there were periods with unusually hot and sunny weather, but still fairly windy, and we removed all the covers to make watering easier. Some of the cool season crops bolted because of the heat and possible water stress, which was probably made worse by the density of the planting and the lack of sufficient fertility. Shade claws could have benefited some plants, and growing different varieties and changing the way we manage the plants could have helped with these changing conditions. Then the weather turned cool and windy and rainy again, but the crops that seemed to prefer these cool conditions had already started to bolt. Some of the other crops matured faster than expected during the warm weather, so they needed to be harvested earlier, but the next batch had been much slower to grow in the cooler conditions that followed, so there has been an extended delay in the gap of what we can harvest. A few different pests have been real problems, but thankfully we haven't had too much damage from the usual slugs and snails. Tiny flea beetles affected a lot of the brassica crops, eating enough small holes in the leaves to knock back the plants and to make the salad leaves a lot less appetizing. We had set up trap crops, but they didn't work so well and I didn't manage them quickly enough, so we've had an abundance of this pest. But now that we are moving into the summer, the damage from this pest should decrease. The cabbage root maggot also affected some crops, especially eating into the edible root of the Japanese turnip. This pest also affected some of the pak choi and kohlrabi. In some cases, the damage to the roots was enough to kill these plants. And carrot flies found the different patches of carrots, with the larvae already burrowing into and damaging the roots, so we are pulling them up and destroying all the carrots to prevent these larvae from maturing. We're going to need to use row covers or some other form of protection from these pests, but that starts to get tricky with so many different types of plants at different stages of development. All of this stuff is interrelated, of course. Insufficient care and inappropriate timing means that the plants are less able to deal with the weather changes and adverse winds. Not supplying enough water and nutrients for the density of the crop leads to stressed plants, which are more susceptible to pest damage and can't grow out of the damage fast enough. So it's not just one thing that needs to be corrected or fixed, and you can see this in one patch of rocket that is really bad. There are obviously fertility issues. The density of the plants is probably too high. There seems to be root and leaf damage from different pests, and these plants probably struggled with the heat and dry conditions when they were smaller. It's hard to tell which issue, if any, came first, but in all these cases, there is something that it could have done to improve the conditions to the plant so that they were more likely to produce something that we would want to eat. These issues often come down to figuring out what we can control and what we can do, and if it's worth the effort, or if it's just a waste of time and resources trying to grow some crops at certain times of the year. This was one of the reasons for establishing these beds of quick rotation crops in the first place, to try to grow a more continuous supply of a range of different crops throughout the year. I wanted to find out which crops grew well in which season in this climate and context, to figure out the timing of key pests that we need to avoid, and knowing how different plants will respond to changing weather conditions that we might get. Of course, we wanted to harvest in abundance, but we also set up this whole section of the gardens to see what would succeed and what would fail. We had been quite successful growing a lot of these crops inside the polytunnels earlier in the spring, where the soil is well developed and there is protection from the harsh weather. In these enclosed spaces, we tend to water regularly when it is warm and sunny, and it is just too early in the season for some of the pests, or it is easier to keep them out. So I have gotten used to these crops being easier to manage under cover, but I need to accept that growing the same crops outside can be very different, and there is a lot more to do and learn. Now that the summer crops in the polytunnels are taking less time to manage, I'm focusing more on getting these quick rotation cropping beds back into production. I'm trying to provide better care and fertility and to improve the timing of the crops, including removing struggling plants earlier and replanting or resowing with something that may grow better. This is all part of learning how to get the most out of a space like this and working to get a more continuous supply of a diversity of fast-growing crops throughout a longer part of the growing season, especially when the polytunnels are full of the longer-growing, heat-loving crops.